Let's get into the broader issues of the day with senior reporter Jonathan Lea and Sky News Bureau Chief out of Queensland, Adam Walters. Gents, great to have you on. We're going to get straight into COP27, the climate talkfest in Egypt. Plenty of emissions over there. This push for reparations, lots of resources, billions of dollars out of places like Australia paid to poorer countries. In the UK, it's on the table, a feature of question time there, and certainly a feature here in Australia. Jonathan, what does it say about the government's intentions? We saw today the Prime Minister did not rule it out.
Peter, good evening to you. No, Anthony Albanese, the new Prime Minister, didn't rule it out, and you can often work out a lot more about what a Prime Minister thinks by what they don't rule out than what they do. The Albanese government is between a rock and a very expensive place here, especially when it comes to the Pacific Islands. It knows that it needs the support of our Pacific neighbours. It's concerned about the influence of China in the region. We've also had Albanese, or the Prime Minister, talk about the fact he wants to host a COP event here of some description. We know European nations have also talked about potentially charging Australia or taxing Australia for our emissions-intensive industries and what we export. I'd be surprised if Mr Albanese didn't in some form end up paying a form of reparation here. It would go a long way to saying that Australia is open for business and supporting climate change. But I also think that it would be diabolical come a future election, and certainly one that the coalition would wedge and hammer the Albanese government on if they did do this. It would be very hard for the government to get out of paying a form of reparation here, but it certainly plays into a nest for the coalition going forward.
Adam Walters, as it should. I mean, the idea that we pay reparations, so-called reparations, I hate the word even in this context, but a climate tax, a UN climate tax to these Pacific neighbours, otherwise they say they'll go to China. Well, I made the point in my editorial, China has opened this year more coal-fired power stations than we have in total in this country. We're being played off a break here.
It wouldn't be the first time, Peter. The hypocrisy is just astounding. There seems to be some sensitivity around the activities of China, yet the scrutiny placed upon this country when it comes to such issues is way out of proportion with that afforded to this very powerful country. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right, let's get into this Islamic women issue. I won't call them brides. They were absolute sympathisers, perhaps even more. In Senate estimates today, the AFP says of the first 4 here in Australia, they don't meet a threshold, and I suspect it's the evidentiary burden that will require in an Australian court, out of a war zone for things that might have happened over the last 10 years. They haven't got that test met, meaning they can't get a control order. It's got to be a judicial decision. Meaning, Jonathan, these women are in the community despite all the promises that would have eyes on them if needed.
Yeah, there was an assurance here that if these women were brought back, their children were brought back, Australia wouldn't have any concerns. Now, many people would believe otherwise. It's imperative here now in the AFP to make sure there aren't any concerns about bringing these women back. And the Albanese government has put its neck on the line. It said it's all about sovereignty, it's all about security, that it is basically in lockstep with the previous government. If something was to go wrong here, it would be a very large mistake.
Adam, I don't want to split hairs because it's two legally important points. One is the AFP today saying there's not a threshold risk there. Their threat assessments seem to say they don't require a control order. Then there's further conversation that they don't meet the requirements of our courts to issue a control order, and that has to be clear evidence out of Syria and the Islamic State area. As I said, going back a decade now, hard to get that stuff out, hard to meet the evidentiary burden. I suspect, even if they had material or suspicions, hard to get it to stack up to Australian standards in our courts. And that's always been the problem, getting these foreign fighters, these Islamic State sympathisers, out of there and back here safely.
Well, that's just it, Peter. But at the end of the day, Australians don't have any sympathy for any margin for the tolerance of extremists. And when they hear these sort of legal technicalities playing out, they immediately think of the 20th anniversary of the Bali bombings and the early release of the man who made the bombs, and we saw the outrage that went through that. Now, the federal police are, of course, very experienced in dealing with Islamist extremism. We saw that with their investigation of Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, their monitoring of ISIS activities. But at the end of the day, Jackie Lambie, with her call for the consideration of ankle bracelets for these women who may have lost their husbands but still wedded to extremist ideas, is getting a lot of support in the community.
John, give me an update on this IR bill. I've seen a lot of business people on Sky News during the day concerned. They want time to get through the detail on this legislation. They say when it was discussed at the Jobs Summit, they were told it would turn up next year. Now it feels like it's being rammed through the Parliament. The crossbench aren't happy, are they?
No, they're certainly not happy, and there's a very good reason why it's being rammed through the Parliament. The Albanese government now has been in power for the better part of 6 months. Things have become more expensive. We've seen that with power prices, and it's desperate for a win. And what we're seeing now from independents across the board is a call to slow this down, to make sure that if we're going to see significant IR reform for the first part in the better part of a decade, it needs to be right. But what you've got is the political reality of a government which needs a win heading into Christmas, a Christmas which looks like being far more expensive.
And Adam, Allegra Spender says it's as big a reform as we had with work choices.
Well, it's not quite on that scale. I mean, we've seen reform in this area with the Construction Commission formed after the findings of the Coal Royal Commission into what it described as the lawlessness of elements, particularly unions, within the construction industry. So we have Tony Burke here insisting that his proposal will do the job, and Jackie Lambie again intervening as one of the senators who doubts the veracity, the integrity of what's been proposed, saying that the construction industry will be without a police officer. Now, that's a real concern.
Jono, you've done a terrific deep dive into the NDIS to give us a better understanding of, yes, it was a great concept at the start, but its implementation is off the rails, a better understanding, particularly of the financials. Give us a sense of the numbers, but also the revelation that taxpayers are paying carers, or I think there's one instance, but there may be more, to provide sexual services.
Yeah, for the better part of the last 3.5, 4 weeks, we've looked explicitly at the NDIS. This is an insurance scheme which is supposed to be about getting the most out of those with a disability and their carers and families. What we've found, though, is in many regards it's actually gone back. I want to show you first and foremost the costs so people have an idea. There was original talks back in 2011 with a productivity review that this would end up costing somewhere in the vicinity of maybe $14 billion. We're now, though, on track. We're looking at $35 billion for this financial year, which means it goes past Medicare, it goes past defence. It will end up costing more than the seniors' pension there as it tracks towards $100 billion a year. It's currently growing at around 13.8%, which means it's more expensive than any other platform, policy or agenda within the government other than paying back interest rates at the moment. So it will become extraordinarily expensive. We have 555,000 people currently on the scheme. That's above the 400,000 originally estimated. And it's estimated now that by 2032, we will have somewhere in the vicinity of more than 1 million people. So there you can see they're the numbers of what was originally thought, and it is growing beyond the expectation of many, many, many experts. And the NDIS's current figures say next year, 2026, or rather by 2026, 741,000 people, and we head towards that million figure. It's not to say this isn't extraordinarily important. We know it is. It is a question, though, of where the money goes and is it going to the right people. And the former minister, Linda Reynolds, told me we can see that people are being rewarded despite the fact that their health is going backwards, because the more they ask for, the more they get. And that is the big problem. Peter.
Just quickly on the sex worker, I need you to make that point.
Yeah, well, what we saw was actually a woman whose NDIS payments weren't tied to sex work. She's actually fudging it and actually paying for an escort once every 3 months to stay sometimes for the weekend. So it is a moral issue here, and it's also an ethical issue. Should she be able to pay for it? Should it be approved? It's being done illegally, but she says it's part of her health.
Well, I don't know that taxpayers would be on board with that. Adam Walters, Jonathan Lea, well done, as I said, Jonathan, on the package. Thank you both for your time tonight.